Yeah.
And of course, all the cakes that go with it, and the glühwein, and
yes, yeah, big fan.
Yes, oh yes.
Well, so we probably should talk a little bit about IDaaS and what you do. So you're the developer advocate for Auth0.
I am one of 7, I think we're at now, 6 or 7 of us.
Wow,
yeah, it's a growing team.
Super developer focused company, which makes it extremely interesting
totally.
for stuff like this. But for people don't listening, and also for my benefit, what's IDaaS? Why is that something that's a problem that developers should be concerned about?
Okay, so just a heads up, I know you gave me a brief outline of the kind of questions you were interested. I did read it at the time, and currently today I've been at a virtual conference all day. So I'm going to be winging a lot of this, but I think that's where the best answers come from.
I definitely think winging. Let's get rid of the script.
Excellent. Well, you might want to refer to it, but it's over on. Actually, it's not even on that screen anymore, so I don't know. I'm just going to go along with whatever happens. This could be exciting. It could be terrible, but it'll definitely be exciting. So IDaaS, or Identity as a Service, is the way I describe most of what IDaaS and Auth0 is usually in relation to other things. People work well with analogies. And while things like Auth0 and Cognito and Keycloak and a number of identity as a service platforms and products, so Keycloak is an open source product that you can run yourself. A lot of people are familiar with them, but it's still a bit of a like, how does it fit into the ecosystem? Whereas conversely, if you think of something like Stripe for payments or PayPal for payments, everybody kind of gets that. So I like to use that as an example point. So ID as a service is kind of like payments as a service, but for identity. Nobody writes their own credit card processing anymore, unless they work for Stripe or PayPal or whoever. So in the same way as there's most people's focus isn't on building identity. Like, that's not what makes their application better. What makes their application better is that their payroll system works better, or their social networking algorithms work better, or their whatever product it is you're building works better than the other person's, or provides a better service to their customers. You're not going to get, most of the time, you're not going to get a better user experience for your customers by rolling your own identity. And that's where ID as a service comes in. It basically abstracts that whole identity layer. It uses standardized protocols, so Auth 2.0 has been around for a while, and OpenID Connect, which sits on top of that, provides the more the authentication side as opposed to the authorization side, which Auth 2.0 provided. So there's all these protocols that provide a standardized way of knowing who's logged in, what their permissions are, all of these things, which you could roll yourself, and then you'd be interoperable with other systems, and you can hook directly into other Auth providers. But why bother? It's like trying to work out how to talk to a credit card provider. Just use a service out there that does it well. At the end of the day, we have developers whose sole job it is to keep this data secure and the application secure and stable and up, that you don't want to be spending time working on that. Like I always thought there was a market somewhere for roll your own, and I'm struggling to find. And I come from an open source background. I ran the Open Source Developers Conference in Australia. I've run various meetups. I didn't actually find out about open source until I got to Australia, which is 3 years after I started working in the IT industry officially, like after university. I used PHP for a long time, but I didn't actually understand what open source or the open source community was. But once I met it, this amorphous blob called the open source community, I just fell in love with the ideals and all the rest of it. And I always used to come from a position of, I'm more invested in looking after my users' data than any third party ever will be. And that's kind of the basis that I used for justifying rolling my own auth and just doing everything myself. And it was fun to learn these things. But then one day somebody said to me, if your product had a data breach and all of your users' usernames and hash passwords, ideally, were leaked, what would the effect of that be? I said, well, I'd struggle. Loyal people would stay. I'd have a huge big PR issue. I'd have to fix it, obviously, maybe shut things down. If it's a side project, then that's a whole lot of my personal time that's just disappeared. He said, what would happen if somebody like Auth0 had a data breach? And I paused for a second, and he answered for me. He said they would go out of business. They are more invested in keeping your users' credentials safe. You are more invested in making sure that your application does what your users want it to do. And that reframing was really interesting for me, because it was at that point where I started reevaluating how I looked at a whole lot of different things in life. I'm still very much an open source proponent, but I see the value now also in the proprietary as a service model out there, the free tier, or the freemium, I think they call it, kind of product usage thing. I still think about data being locked away, and I still analyze whether or not, what does the escape capsule look like? What's the way of getting out of any one system that I buy into? To the extent that I even emailed 1Password, well, but tweeted them, because I think Twitter nowadays is the equivalent of the emailing a manager. I'm going to tweet at them, and then they have to respond because it was public. Anyway. So I've sent them a message saying, "What's your risk mitigation plan? Like, if your servers are completely fried, have I lost all of my passwords? I know that the data is secure while it's in there because it's encrypted in transit and only decryptable in one of their applications, and only with my private keys. But what happens if all the data gets lost altogether? Like, I don't actually have a backup. Do I need to keep backups?" And they gave me a response which made me very happy that, yes, it's extremely unlikely that anything is ever going to go wrong. And if it does, then so many other things are going to have gone wrong that the last thing I'll be worried about is not having my passwords anymore. So, but it's still worth keeping in mind.
It definitely, and you touched on a few things here. And one thing is that, as a developer, you always want to know the inner workings of everything that you do. It's kind of in your nature to want to pull stuff apart.
Yeah.
So to hand off something, is always it's always difficult. It's always difficult to leave part of your baby to someone else.
Yeah.
But Are there still advantages to doing it yourself? And when you're using, ID as a service, is there a point where it becomes unscalable and you have to go back? Because, one thing that's interesting is that when we build stuff with scale in mind, usually.
Sure.
And so sometimes, while it might not make sense for the short term, you think, well, maybe building an authentication service is going to help me in the long run, and understanding how that works. Is that true, or are we really missing the mark of what's important when we're considering these things?
I think when it comes to, so there are a couple of questions in there. So there was one about scale. Is there any point at which it would make sense to write your own? There's two things I'm reading into that. Either you're saying, if you don't have enough scale, if you're so small that you don't need a whole platform to outsource your identity to, is that a valid option? I won't say the word valid because that's very judgy, but is that a better option, or are there any kind of pros and cons to weigh up at that point? The other end of the spectrum is, if you are an absolutely massive company that has thousands of people logging in all day long, then do you want to trust that to a third-party provider who might not be able to scale with you? I'm not sure which one of those perspectives you're coming from, but I can talk to both of them.
Yeah, let's tackle both of those, because they're
sure.
They kind of speak to different people.
Yes. So on the small side, if I was to start my own side project and I needed some kind of identity, why would I use something like Auth0 rather than rolling my own? And I'll take two tangible examples. So one is, as I say, I'm from a PHP background, and I'm not sure whether you're familiar with PHP at all, or Laravel. Laravel has, so PHP's got Composer, which is kind of like NPM for Node world. And Laravel also has Artisan, which is kind of the command line management tool thing for Laravel. So you can do various things with Artisan. So you can do Artisan make auth, which is a one-liner. You run it, and probably within about a minute, it'll say that's done. Then you do Artisan migrate, or make migrate or something or other, and it'll then take your database migrations and update your MySQL if you're doing a standard out-of-the-box type thing. It'll update the user table or create a user table or something it basically does it all for you. So within 5 minutes, probably less, you've got authentication, and it'll build I think even out of the box, it'll build a login page, a password reset page, and a password change page. Maybe one or two of those might be missing, but definitely the login and sign up is there. So it's fairly easy, and it uses bcrypt by default. So your password hashes are secured in the way that is currently best practice. And I'm sure if that ever changed, then so would their implementation of that. So it's easy. You don't need to go to a third-party provider. You don't need to sign up for anything. You don't need to agree to any terms and conditions. You don't need to create an application and work out how to implement the Auth0 SDK in Laravel. So yes, it's a lot faster. The scalability side, all of the load is now added onto your server. So every time somebody wants to do any kind of bcrypt stuff, that's being run by your server. Anytime somebody wants to change a password, that's being done by your server. You need to make sure that you can send emails, which nowadays emails is something that websites do a lot less often. Email configuration is a lot harder. I used to run my own email server, and just keeping on top of things like DMARC and SPF records and all of those things, and making sure that my servers had an SMTP account to connect to send emails and didn't trigger spam and all those things. You don't want to have to worry about those. I hated those things, which is why I don't run my own email server anymore. So there's that side to it. And the login is one thing, but as soon as you want to do multi-factor authentication, you want to send an SMS out to make sure that the person is actually logged in, you've got to implement that yourself within Laravel. If you want to do any other kind of authentication mechanism, if it was like an email-based single click, like the way that Slack works, when you log into Slack and it says, we've sent you a link, and you click on it and automatically logs you in, those kind of things you'd have to implement yourself. So this is where IDaaS as a service platforms come in useful, because they've got that all in there already. Now, some of those features and functionalities, things like enterprise Active Directory integration, for example, that's not something most developers are going to need. And if you do, it's probably within an enterprise space. And at that point, with Auth0 anyway, and probably most of the other providers, there is a level at which you need to upgrade. So the freemium free tier is only going to give you so much. But in, I would say, 99% of cases, 100% of cases that I've spoken to people about, most people have been fine with a free tier almost forever. It's only if you know that you're going to have to grow that you build that into your plans, and you can have 7,000 people every month logging into your system. You can have 2.5 million, as many customers as you want in your database, and Auth0 is still free. So the free tiers really do give us a lot. And same for Stripe. Stripe's slightly different because they always charge a percentage on top. But most of the systems you look at, there'll be a free tier. I'm using Sanity, which is a headless CMS for my personal website now, and they're free tier as well. I'm probably never going to have to pay for that. So there's so much that we can do as developers who want to start on our MVPs, on our personal side projects. We can use Netlify or Vercel for free. We can use all of the platform, all of the frameworks are pretty much free. That's all open source. I don't see there being a point in not implementing something like an IDaaS as a service early, because it means that in the future, if your application does scale, you're ready to jump. You don't have to, if you wrote a Laravel app and then down the line you think, well, now I need to do single sign-on, Active Directory integration, and multi-factor authentication, I could spend a couple of months doing that, or I could spend a couple of weeks doing a migration to something like Auth0. If you'd done Auth0 in the first place, you wouldn't be having that issue. And it probably wouldn't have cost you anything to do that in the first place. So that's the small application side of things. On the big app side of things, does Auth0 scale? I'll give you a really short answer to that one, because my first answer was really long. Atlassian use Auth0 for all of their identity, and I think if they can scale, if we can scale with them, I think we'll be fine with most other applications.
Yeah, that's a real drop mic kind of moment.
Pretty much, yeah.
Talking about this, when you talked about a lot of different services, implementing and the free tiers that would come on. And this is really this huge shift in architecture. This particularly accelerated over the last 10 years when you look at the different microservices and kind of SaaS platforms and everything. Is there a risk that as developers, we're going to collectively lose knowledge in how all of these systems in different areas work? and therefore almost become a little bit lazy, or do you feel more the opposite? Do you feel that this is going to free up people to really work on really cool, interesting, individual niche aspects and they no longer have to worry about this? What's it, as a whole, when you look at the architecture and the environment,
Sure.
What are the risks and where do you think we're heading in that?
I feel like that's a loaded question. I sensed excitement in your alternative in the latter approach. I'm trying to think of a good analogy for this, because there will be one. But when we look at any kind of technology improves all the time. The replacement of the Gutenberg press with the mechanized, like the automated printing press, it put plate setters out of jobs, and it means that we don't have as broad a knowledge. Like, there are fewer people who know about all of the things that went into making a manual printing press, but that hasn't made our lives worse. There are so many examples of where things have become either automated or centralized, so that there are few people who have to do the things that make that work, and more people can take advantage of the fact that it just exists. So I don't see there being a negative, like a con to it being platformized, if that's a word we can coin, or maybe somebody else already has, and I'm in breach of copyright or something. I don't think there's a risk. However, one of the things that I emphasize whenever I'm giving any of my conference talks around general security practices, there's a couple that I do on the OWASP top 10, and I do a demo of 5 of them and show actual working code of injection attacks and these things. That understanding them is still going to help us as developers to understand what's happening under the hood. There is a lot of black box magic that goes on, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but understanding why it's a good thing and having a concept of even 10% of what goes on in that black box will not just help us appreciate the fact that it's taken off our hands, but also perhaps help us in designing other systems as well. An example of that, I worked, before I was at Auth0, I was a security consultant / contract developer, which usually went along the lines of, hey, we've got this project that we need a security consultant on, can you join us? And then 2 weeks later when I joined, they'd say, oh, that project's been canned, can you help us update our Magento website? That's why I was mostly a contract developer. But one of the things we did, and it was actually a suite of Magento sites for, they're called Hanes now, I can't remember what they were before, but they're the Australian company behind Bonds and Burley and all of those things, the clothing in Manchester kind of company. And they had about 9 different websites where you could buy various things from. And each one, if you had an account on 2 of them, you would have 2 separate accounts, but they wanted to move towards a single checkout model. So what I designed was a system that allowed, and they also had to be totally independent. They had to be able to choose which of the 9 sites were opted into the single checkout option. If 2 sites were opted in, say Bonds and Burley, for example, and you made a purchase only from Bonds, then it should actually the checkout should be through Bonds. If there was something in your cart from multiple sites, then it would go through the centralized checkout. So all sorts of interesting workflows and decision points to be made during the checkout process. And what I did was I borrowed from the OAuth spec. So we basically we didn't use OAuth specifically, but we used the whole concept of passing auth keys around and having server-to-server communications that were enabled and verified through browser communications. I won't go into the weeds on this one, but essentially I used this existing protocol that was all around authorization to create a centralized shopping cart system, which was sort of authorization based, but not quite. But having that understanding meant that I was able to design, possibly shave days or weeks off the design process for the application, because there was something in my mind that I thought, oh, this is a little bit like that. So understanding the security models and how identity works and how you would store passwords and all of these things when it comes to, do I go with an ID as a service provider or do I roll my own? I think having that understanding is always going to put you in better stead, but it's not something that's a prerequisite. Mm-hmm. And to the other part of your question, does it free us up to do more? innovation, and that's exactly what all of the platform services do. We don't host our own websites anymore. We stick them in the cloud somewhere, whether it's serverless or it's I don't know, S3 or EC2, or even if we go to Linode and set up an actual Linux server, we don't manage bare metal anymore. Most of the time, we don't even manage operating systems. Most of the time, it is cloud. Most of the time, it's static. We can just host everything in a CDN. So there are so many things we don't do anymore, which allows us to focus more on creating new things, whether it's for fun and excitement and the joy of creating something, or whether it's because you've got this idea and you want to get an MVP out there quickly. Just think about 10 years ago, where we're now, 2020, probably even 15 years ago. If you had an idea for a new project, you'd spend probably, I don't know, at least 2 to 4 weeks setting up your local development environment, designing a data model, getting some kind of staging environment set up somewhere. You probably wouldn't even worry about CI/CD at that point. You'd need to create a GitHub project, all of these things, some of which we still have to do nowadays, but you can start an MVP nowadays and get something up and running in probably about a day versus 2 to 4 weeks before. A Gatsby app with a simple Express API, authentication, and Stripe payments. You could have a mini shop functional and taking payments within a week. This is something that years ago, a decade ago, you would have thought, no way in hell I'm going to get something up that quickly. So I think it's already proven by using these platforms and basically outsourcing the stuff that doesn't make you different to somebody else. Focus on using your time to make yourself different, to make your app stand out from the rest, to do the thing that you think there's a business need for or a market need for.
Yeah, I completely agree. You know, and,
I thought you might.
and I liked your analogy, you know, of the plate setters, you know, for the press, because you know you see that now there's plate setters out there today that don't want to lose their, you know, that don't want to lose their relevance and want to keep going, you know, and kind of push these narratives.
There still is room for these plate setters. You look at the Loom. There's still a place for Looms out there. You have communities built up around maintaining these heritage skills that might never need to be used. But hey, look at where we are at the moment. Maybe in a few years' time, we might be living in siloed communities. We won't have international travel of any sort. We won't be able to ship things internationally because maybe the virus is modified and now anything that gets touched is just deadly forever. Maybe I can't even go to Melbourne anymore. Maybe I'm stuck to the 20 Ks around my house. There might become a time when we need these old skills. So it's definitely worthwhile holding on to them, but we don't all need to know them right now. In the same way as we don't all need to know how to be accountants. That's still a thriving and valid skill to have, but we don't all need to know that. If one day, I don't know, I can't talk to an accountant anymore and I still need to submit my tax return, then maybe I need to learn some more and there'll be a lot of resources out there to help me. So I don't think we need to forget these skills. And look, I don't even know how many I think we're about 700, 800 people at Auth0 now, and some large percentage of that is going to be software engineers working on the identity platform. If we didn't have people with those skills, we wouldn't have anyone to employ. There would be no product. So the skills are definitely still needed, just fewer people. Yeah, no, and that makes perfect sense. You painted a bleak picture of the pandemic. I might have to go back and Google how to become a plate setter for a press. That's right, and then you'll be able to. But the problem is that I don't know. Maybe plate setters will actually be a dead job in the future, in that bleak future, because if you can't distribute things anyway, what's the point in having a newspaper?
This is true.
It'll be word of mouth from 8 meters.
We'll go back to the town choir.
Yes, I could do that. Just give me a bell. I'll shout at people.
Yeah. Do you think this whole landscape, you know, from a security perspective, which is something that, you know, I'm incredibly interested in, having all these different SaaS platforms that connect together, and also having, identity as a service, sourcing this, it obviously means that we can we can use stronger services, we can have less vulnerabilities and our authentication services. But when we're all using centralized systems, it becomes, we're all using the same things. We're potentially having all the same vulnerabilities, and potentially creating a mass problem. When it comes to security, using this architecture of microservices, and having to need hundreds of these different API keys and session tokens, do you feel like this creates a new kind of security threat as someone that's kind of working on the, in the front lines of this new kind of architecture?
I think everything creates a new security threat.
Good answer.
Bug fixes create new security threats. Hiring a new developer who's not familiar with your code creates a new security threat. There's no way of stopping vulnerabilities. And this is the age-old contention that will always happen. In order to keep things safe, the good people of this world have to get it right every single time. And the bad people in this world only have to get it right once. As soon as that vulnerability is found and exploited, whatever happens, you're dead, or like not figuratively, I mean, not literally, hopefully figuratively dead. You've got a data breach, maybe you've lost money, whatever the side effect is. Somebody only has to succeed at attacking you once. And we have to keep the defenses up and functional 100% of the time, which is impossible. So yes, there are always security vulnerabilities. You asked whether, I don't know whether I'm paraphrasing incorrectly, but the homogenization and shrinking of all of the services that we have, if we're all using the same system, does that make us less secure? In many ways, I think it's the opposite. If there's only one tool to audit, then as soon as something's found, you can fix it faster. It's the same as the whole open source analogy where people say, there are so many people working on it that there could be a vulnerability. Yeah, but there are also so many people looking at it that the vulnerability can be found. You can't find vulnerabilities in black boxes. So, and then on the other hand, we've discussed platform services being black boxes. So there certainly is that balance there of making sure that from a commercial sense, that your proprietary software is protected commercially as well as from a security perspective, while also providing enough transparency and auditing to make sure that people are confident that the systems and tools that they're using are doing what they expect them to do. So they'll always be there, and it's ever-moving goalposts, to be honest. I don't think that going one way or the other, like going more towards platforms and cloud native, or whatever you want to call it, going more towards that is going to make us more or less secure than going more towards let's roll your own. And I mean, there's power in being different as well, right? If you've got 74 different or 74 million different implementations of authorization, then attacking one is likely to not, an attack that would work on one is likely to not work on all of the others, because they're different implementations. They're based on different stacks, which themselves have different vulnerabilities. It's like trying to attack a static website with a WordPress hack. It's not going to do anything. So there's certainly power in being different. But with that comes a higher cost in terms of maintenance. You need exponentially more people to be looking at each individual bit of code to make sure that it stays safe, and addressing vulnerabilities that are reported and looking for vulnerabilities that might not have been found. That that itself isn't scalable. Like, you can't keep putting more and more people onto making secure software, because we're humans, we are fallible. We are very good at writing insecure software as a species. So I think minimizing that and honing in on a few really good implementations that can be kept secure by those who excel in their field, I think that will keep us stronger.
Yeah, no, I agree with I agree with that. but there comes a concern, with this, that and how it shapes. But I think that it's going to be shaped by, the companies that are doing well and innovative, that are moving us forward. So it's great. The people coming up there to, the half-hour kind of spot on this talk, people that are interested in using Auth0 and implementing it, what's the best way for them to start? Can we have a look at the dashboard for people that are interested right now?
Let's open some things up. I need a browser. Bring that onto this screen here. Do a screen share. Screen sharing tip. Screen sharing is easiest with 2 monitors. Thank you for that.
You've probably got 14. I think. I don't know.
I won't start counting now. We could be here a while. All right, my screen share's in there. I think you need to drag it into the. There we go. All right. So, what should we have a look at? Well, the easiest way to get started is the auth0.com developers page, or even just the home page, but developers is obviously more focused at developers to find out more. Sign up or log in. I've not actually looked at this. Let's have a look at start building. Let's see what this does for us. Okay, who wants us to create an account? I have an account already, so I'm not going to sign up. Is there a login? No, let's go back. All right, I'll just log in over here.
There's some subtle Atlassian branding.
Yes, as you can tell, we're quite proud of that little arrangement there. All right, let's log in. I'll go back to the developers page here. So I don't think I'll actually dwell on this very much. There's some cool tools we've come up with as well. Does this actually work? It does work. We've started creating creating mechanisms to make it easier to personalize and style. So one of the things, I've been at Auth0 now for 2 years. I was telling people just a few weeks ago, it was 3 years. It feels like it's been a lot longer than 2 years. It's been a very good 3 years in my head. But I've been using Auth0 itself as a product, as a developer for many years before that. And the thing that got me into it, and as you'll probably tell, as will be kind of carried throughout this part of the session, what's the best way of getting into it is just to use it. The documentation for me was the thing that just nailed it. I've actually had people come up to me at conferences and say, we use the Auth0 documentation to implement insert name of competitor brand here, because the documentation that we have is so good at helping people understand identity principles and protocols and the OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect flows and those kind of things that help them debug the issues they're having in competitor products, which I think, I mean, obviously I prefer them to be using Auth0, but I think at the end of the day, that's testament. If the product that we create helps developers understand something, even if they don't use that product, that's a win as well. So if you come in here and type in, now you are with Git Guardian, aren't you?
Yes.
Oh, look, it's in there. So you start typing it in, and now it's going to say, well, here's the logo. We'll give you this blue because that's kind of a bit like the logo, so that kind of looks good. You can define which identity provider you want to log in with. Obviously, it'll be GitHub, right? So we've got a couple of tools here that'll let you play around with the styling, just to see how it all works. But let's jump into the actual dashboard itself. So this is what happens when you log in or create a new account. You end up on this Getting Started page. I have a number of different tenants. So tenants are basically, how best to describe this? Imagine you've got a side project, and that side project has an API and a front end, and that's it. So you'll create a tenant for that side project. And in there, you will define your front end as being an application and the API as being an API. And then the tokens that are generated within this tenant are usable by both of those. Let's say at work, you've also got a mobile phone app and a standard Python web application, plus a number of APIs and various other things. You'd create a whole separate tenant for that. So each tenant will contain configuration for each set of systems. And I think one other good way of working out whether or not you need a new tenant is each tenant has its own set of users. So if you don't want to share users between two different systems, I don't want my side project users to automatically have access to my business products, for example. So you'll create a new tenant for each of those. And once you've got an account, you can come in here and create a new tenant. So I've got this tenant called Ben Dechrai Test, where I stick all of my test stuff. And when let's say you're creating a new React app, you can come in, you can create a new application. I mentioned already 4 different types. You've got native, which is your desktop clients or your native mobile apps. Single page apps are things that only run in the browser. There's no backend at all. So if you're looking at something like Next.js, that's an interesting twist because that's a bit more hybrid. So you've got your front end and your back end in there. Then you've got your traditional web apps over here, and then machine to machine, where you might have an API that needs to talk to another API, where there's no human involved and there's no requirement to understand which user is interacting with the system. It's more of I'm a machine and I have access to certain things on that machine. That makes sense. There's no real user in this. You can still infer that if you've got a command line app, for example, that needs to talk to an API, then you can still have the command line interface tool spawn off a login mechanism via a browser to get an identity out, so that you've got a user identity that you can then use when talking to the API. But inherently between the machine-to-machine communication is mostly about just the access token, not the ID token. Let me know if you want me to jump back and go in more into tokens as well, which we can do. So if I was building my React app, for example, I'll come in here and I'll say it's a single page application. Call this React app, so I know I can delete it later. And then I mentioned before, the documentation is one of the things that really sold me into Auth0 back in the day. We have what's called, I forgot what it's called, live documentation. That's what it's called. So I'll just jump over to here to the settings. So when I created this React app, the Auth0 systems generated a client ID and also this client secret for me, which I suppose I can share with the world because we're not going to do anything with it. So this secret and the client ID were generated randomly, cryptographically securely. If we come over to the quick start and say I want to build a React app, this is going to take me through the process of configuring the main parts in the Auth0 dashboard that I need to configure for my application. So that's the callback URL, the logout URL, and the web origins. I'll cover that in a sec. But the most bestest bit, my England is very good all of a sudden, is this live documentation will inject the relevant variables into the code. So I can basically copy and paste this. And I don't need to, often documentation will say, insert your client ID here. It's like, no, we've got it already. So we'll just put it into the documentation for you. So this live documentation, you can view this documentation outside of the scope of one of these applications as well, and it'll put in placeholder text. But if you're viewing it within the scope of editing or managing this application at the top here, then it'll say, well, we have this information already. We'll just put it in for you. So that's something I love. It says here you can get through this in 15 minutes to implement Auth0 in a React app. I reckon if you've done it a couple of times, 15 minutes accurate. First time, it might take you half an hour or something.
We'll time you. We'll time you.
You can also download sample code, and that sample code has your IDs in it already as well. It's just crazy.
I think this just shows it's such a difference, being from Geek Guardian, a developer first company too, and Auth0, obviously a developer first company that's very advanced. It really shows the difference, going through these little things like live documentation. It really shows, when a company's been built by developers for developers. It really shows in this. And none of this is really that hard, but I've never seen this before. This kind of live documentation.
It really is. It's that little bit tricky enough to make it a bit of a blocker to implementing as a priority. If you're
anyone that's ever written documentation will know that they cannot wait to finish that task. So go back and to say, okay, we're gonna do the opposite. We're gonna put a huge amount of attention into documentation.
Yeah.
It's a very, very cool and necessary thing.
That's right. And this is the first company I've worked for a long time. Before that, as I say, I was a contractor. So, I mean, I worked for companies, but I wasn't an employee. But this is also the first platform as a service type, well, not platform as a service, but as a service company that I've worked for, where documentation has been really important. So I can't compare to other companies, but I was really quite surprised and happy. Another word for happy. Where's my thesaurus? When I joined, to find out that not only was there a developer relations team, but we also have a dedicated content team for creating blog posts and how-tos. We have a dedicated education team that will create the more educational type videos that are directed more at like client training, as opposed to the kind of stuff that I do, which is talking in the more generic, sometimes more focused. I'll get quite nitty-gritty into the auth0 side of things as well sometimes. But my talks are more focused towards developers who aren't necessarily already working for one of our customers, who are trying to learn more about identity or security. So we have so many different teams that are all focused on helping developers in different ways to understand all the different aspects of what they need to know to get this right. And I think you can often look at this and think to yourself, there's like, how much of this is marketing? How much of this is just trying to fill the space with our kind of conversation? But every single person in each team that I talk to is just so genuinely interested in helping developers be better developers. It's actually overwhelming sometimes. Like it feels like we are like auth0's community / documentation / communication areas that talk to developers are just populated by the kinds of people you would find at really grassroots open source conferences. They're my people. I like it. Anyway, that's enough of me meandering down a whole different segue.
Don't worry, I'm good at steering you down these segues.
oh, good. I just have to remember to try and bring myself back. I would like to show the actual implementation of this. We could, time depending, like we've got 22 minutes left of the schedule. I don't know how your plans are going for that. I could try and start up a React app really quickly, or like a Gatsby app. I'm liking Gatsby a lot at the moment, and implement auth0 with that. Or we can have a look at something that I wrote, which is called a login challenge, which takes away the whole need to set up a local development environment and just demonstrate the power of and speed of auth0. That'll take about 5 minutes.
Let's you steer the way. You steer the way. Both of them sound super interesting. So
all right. Well, let's tempt fate, and let's go with Gatsby create. I don't think I've got a test. That's Gatsby create test. All right, we'll create a new Gatsby app. And over here, we've already got our React app set up over here. So I'm going to go back to, not back to applications. There's a React app I was working on. Let's just rename this to Gatsby test. So that's what we're working on at the moment. Let's see how this is going. Is that meant to look like that? Gatsby, it's not Gatsby create, is it? Gatsby new test. Not going to work. There we go. Cloning something else, something or other. So I'll just bloody fly. While that's building in the background, I'll just touch on when we looking at the documentation earlier. It made a reference to callback URL, logout URL, and web origin. So I'll just go through what those are and why they're important while that's building in the background. So the standard OAuth 2.0 flow, basically, if you imagine the three main elements of any kind of authentication flow or authorization flow, you've got the browser, which is the person who's trying to log into something. You've got the client, which is the website you're trying to log into. So this is the client in the terminology of OAuth, where you've got client and a provider, like identity client and identity provider. The identity client is going to be the website you're trying to log into. The browser is what you're trying to log into the website with. Then you've got the identity provider, which in this case is auth0. That's where your login happens. The the way that it works is when I go to the website that I want to log into and I'm not logged in, it's going to redirect me to auth0. So that's a response that comes back to my browser. It's basically a 302 redirect, which takes me off to the auth0 server. Auth0 is then going to check to see whether or not I'm logged in. And there's various bits of information that get sent along there. There's the client ID, so that auth0 knows which client I'm logging in at, so it can pull out the configuration. And there's also the auth0 domain, so it knows which tenant I'm logging into. Once I'm then logged in, it needs to somehow get some tokens to the web application so that it can then use those for the ID token to work out who I am and the access token to be able to do things with other systems. We need to get that there securely somehow. So what you could do is just do a, once a person's logged in to the identity provider, is redirect or send a response back to the browser with the tokens as a redirect to the application, to the server, so that it can then pull those tokens out. The problem we have now is that those tokens are, they have to be in the query string, because that's the only way you can pass the information back via a redirect. They could potentially be cached. They could be shared if you're using Firefox, for example, and you've got multiple machines, then Firefox have this share your history type thing. You could even in the future accidentally, when you're typing in a URL, do an autocomplete where it includes the tokens in the top there, which the tokens are probably going to be expired. That's going to create a bad user experience. But the worst part is you can get a man-in-the-middle attack and have those tokens taken away. So we want to avoid that. So what actually happens is rather than returning any tokens, it returns an authorization code, which is I think it's 32 character length, randomized string of some sort. There's nothing in there that tells you about who I am, what I have access to, which website I'm trying to log into. Any of that is totally random. But auth0 will hold on to that. And then so it returns it back to my browser as a redirect back to the server. The server then has the authorization code, and it can then make a server-to-server connection back to auth0 and say, hey, I've got this authorization code. Here's my client ID and my client secret, because it's like a Python app, for example. Here's my client ID and my secret. I want to exchange this authorization code for tokens. Auth0 then says, hey, I noticed that this authorization code was just generated for Ben when he logged in to the same client ID that you're saying you are. And I can verify that the client secret you've sent me is the one that I have associated with that client ID. Therefore, I know you're the application that should get access to these tokens. So I'll now send you an ID token and an access token and maybe also a refresh token. So that's how the tokens get over there.
Right.
So this point here where the authorization code gets sent back, that's the callback URL. We can define in here what the authorized callback URLs are, because we don't want those authorization codes accidentally going to the wrong place. Not just within our application, but a whole different domain. So say I'm running bendechrai.com, and I want the codes to be able to go back to my domain. I don't want some man-in-the-middle attack to redirect the authorization code elsewhere, or for a browser plugin to redirect you to the wrong place instead, or any of these things to happen. So although at the browser plugin level, that's probably not going to help anyway. But we don't want, because the callback URL is actually passed in the original request for during the login redirection. We want auth0 to say, hey, that's not an authorized callback URL. We're never going to send an authorization code there. Therefore, your login request is broken, and it'll pop up an error. So that's what callback URL is for. Logout URL, very similarly, is if somebody hits the logout button, where can they be redirected to afterwards? We don't want them accidentally being redirected to somebody else's website, or even worse, a phishing website that looks like that website, and then they're prompted to log in again, and they think, oh, I was just logged out, I don't know why, and they type in there. So we don't want people being redirected to the wrong places. And then finally, we've got the web origin, which is where requests can come from the server, in order to check things like, is the person already logged in? If you want to do a transparent or a silent re-authentication, that is finding out whether or not the user is still logged into the auth0 tenant, because the web application has either lost the session, or maybe you're running a single page app and they've opened in a new tab, therefore the state has been lost. There are ways of requesting from auth0 information without redirecting the user to actually log in. And we want to make sure that those come from the correct web origin, again, so that third-party systems can't start making requests for information they shouldn't have access to. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. I mean, it's very clear here. It's amazing to find out what's going on in the background, though, too, behind all this.
So 3 very innocuous little boxes. But essentially what they do is they allow you to really nail down exactly where auth0 is allowed to send information to or request information to in relation to the application, this one application that you're configuring. So in this case, we're setting up a single page app, which is going to be running on localhost 48,000. I think that's the default for Gatsby. So I'm just going to put those in there. If I was also creating a native app, then I would create a whole new application for that native app. And in the callback URLs, they would be specific to that application. So you don't overload at this point here. If you were going to go into production, you could put your prod URL in here as well. Or you might have separate tenants, one for development, one for production, however you want to run it. But you can have multiples in here. But I'm just going to leave it at that for now. Hit save changes. This is one that a lot of people forget, me included. And we've got a suggestion going back into, this is one of the things I love about my role, is I get to speak to developers about the pains that they have with the product. And I sit on that, and this is the same for you, Devra, right? We sit on that cusp between the business and the user or the customer. And when the customer turns around and says, this is really shit, I keep forgetting to hit the save changes button. And you can go back to your product team and say, hey, how about we put some text somewhere on the page saying you haven't saved your changes? So that's one of the recommendations, one of the suggestions we've fed back in. Whether or not or when that'll happen, who knows? But it's nice to have that ability to talk back into the business and share developers' pains.
It's the difference between a developer-focused company and some other corporate-focused companies. We probably have similar end clients, which aren't necessarily the developers, but the developers are the ones that are using the product most of the time. Yeah. So it's important to have that line of communication up. But you get a lot of suggestions in a lot of interesting ways too. I'm sure you.
Yes. Yeah. All right. So we have our Gatsby app installed. I'm not going to start it just yet. And Gatsby is a fun one because we recently released an SDK specifically for React. Before that, it used to be, there was the auth0-spa-js library, which was for general single-page apps. But we made one that was better for React, which basically plugs straight in, and you need to do very little configuration. So I'm going to install that one because Gatsby is essentially React. The only difference is this point here, I don't know if you're familiar with Gatsby and React. React has this, the index.js page that is the root of the application. And in there, there's this call to render on the React DOM. And in there, you render the application. And this is generally wrapped by, I think there's like a strict mode wrapper or something in a default React app when you build one. But what we're going to be doing is replacing it with this auth0 provider. With providers, the problem that this solves for us is that it used to be that if you wanted a component down the chain, and React is very component-driven, you have components inside components inside components, and each of these components can feed information into those other components. And if, say, for example, you've got a login button, and it's a component that's 7 levels down in the hierarchy, then at some point at the top where you've got your authorization stuff, you need to then feed that information down a waterfall into this component. And then if anything changes or you move it somewhere else, then things break. You have to remember where the data is being flowed. A provider basically allows us to wrap the whole root element of the application. And then we use a hook that allows any component to pull information out, in this case about auth0 or about your connection to auth0, without having to get this information to flow down. We'll see that in action in a bit. But this is different because basically what we're doing here is this is the React method of doing things, but this doesn't exist in Gatsby. In Gatsby, we have the Gatsby browser file here where we can make changes to, the root element. And there's a mechanism called wrap root element, which will allow you to take the root element of the Gatsby app, or the React app, sort of, that gets built during the Gatsby build time, And the Gatsby browser.js is basically what's run when the browser is emulated for creating the React app. So we need to do something slightly different. I can never remember exactly what it is, but if we look at auth0.github.io, auth0 React, this one here is the slightly more techie developer kind of documentation than the friendly quick starts. But I like it because if you do a search on here for Gatsby and click on that link, here's the code that we need for the Gatsby browser.js file. So I'm just going to copy and paste that, and then we can have a look at what it's doing. So as with any kind of React work that we do, we need to pull in React. We installed the auth0 React SDK just down here recently. From there, we can get this auth0 provider, which is what we're wrapping the entire application in. The way that Gatsby does it differently to React is we call this wrap-root element method, or it calls it. Pass into it the element, which is the root element of the whole application, which we're then going to render out here, surrounded by the auth0 provider wrapper. And that's basically it. The only other thing that we're adding, and the main, if we jump back in here, this documentation doesn't have it. It's got the domain, the client ID, and the redirect URI. We're adding in a on-redirect callback. This is because the routing mechanism in React is different, in Gatsby is different to React. And we need to use the navigate method from Gatsby in order to navigate the user back to the URL that they had recently requested. So for example, if you're going to /admin, and that's a protected endpoint or a protected route, then you want to make sure they get back to that route once they've done the authorization or the authentication process. In React, that's handled automatically because of the way React Routers runs. Because here, this is in the, sorry, I always get confused between React and Gatsby. No, I'm getting it right. So in React, it's got the React Router type stuff working for you already. In Gatsby, because this is being built, there's some kind of difference that happens. I haven't looked too much into it, but all I know is that we need to use the on-redirect callback to actually pass the callback URL that we want in. And then from that, we can then use the navigate method to tell Gatsby to navigate to the route that the user originally wanted before they were forced to log in. It's bad. We need to know about that. Yeah, so that's that. We need to pull in the domain and the client ID. Obviously, you'd probably put this into an environment variable, environments file. But for the purpose of this demo, I'm not going to bother with that.
Yeah, so you're hurting my soul right now, hard coding. I'll forgive you.
I appreciate it. If we have time at the end, we can probably do some optimization, some best practice stuff here as well.
Just don't put this in a Git repository, and I'll be
well,
okay.
The thing is, the client ID is public information. It doesn't hurt.
Right.
Because remember, this is going to run in the browser at the end of the day. So everything we put in here has to be publicly available anyway. Let's just for arguments, because I like to go off on tangents. So Gatsby will automatically pull in .env.development without having to install the .env package or anything. Now, if in Gatsby, and this might be interesting to people who haven't used Gatsby very much, in React, you can do things like auth0 domain, and then we'll put this here. And then theoretically, what you should be able to do at this point is do a process.env.auth0 domain.
You don't need to put React in the environment file?
So this here will only be available to Gatsby.
Right.
Because the environment variables have to be available to Gatsby during the build process. But if you had something like Sanity API, you wouldn't want that to be public. You don't want that to be available to React. So this here might be a secret that you don't want to be leaked, but this here has to be available to the React app because it's the React app that's running in the browser that's going to be doing the authentication, not the Gatsby app during build time. So for this, we actually need to put Gatsby in front. I don't know why it's Gatsby instead of React. It would make more sense if it was React, because we want React to know about this. But what Gatsby does is it's going to pull out anything that starts with Gatsby underscore and make that available to the React app once it's built.
Cool. Cool.
A little bit of a, I don't know if it's undocumented. I mean, it is documented somewhere, but something that's a bit of a gotcha for a lot of people, and was for me for a while, is this here is going to work. But say, for example, you did something like now, theoretically, that should work, yeah? But basically what we're doing is we're saying to process env, give us your values, deconstruct it, and pull out the Gatsby auth0 domain. Now, the thing is that this won't actually work, because what Gatsby does during build time is it looks for this string in the code. It has to be process.env.gatsby underscore whatever. So in fact, it searches for this string. And during build time, it does a textual substitution. So the resultant code that React runs will actually look like that.
Right.
Because it'll build it and it'll do a text replace. So if you do a decomposition or try and access the process.env variables in any other way, it's not going to work. And the problem is debugging that is a really hard thing. It took me days to work it out the first time. But yes, I'm going to leave it like that, just because I'm lazy right now. So we've got that done. So theoretically, we're now all set up. But the thing is that we don't have a login, logout button, or any need to check authentication. So let's have a look at layout. This one here. Footer, main, header. Let's go into the header. This one here. All right. And again, I'm not going to follow best practice. I'm not going to break out the components. We're just going to get it working just to see how easy it is. So let's have a look at our homepage. It probably helps if I start running. So it's usually Gatsby.develop or Gatsby space develop. I've got a shortcut in there because I run it so often. In my head, I always read it as Google Dev, but it's not. So this is now going to basically build the whole application and create a React app. And it's strange because Gatsby runs in React, but it also generates a static website that is React. I never remember where it sits in the hierarchy.
What got you into Gatsby above React? You know, as a, well, I mean, not Gatsby above React, but what is it that you like about Gatsby as a framework for React?
So, a colleague of mine, James Quick, the other day released a YouTube video that talked about how he'll probably never use React create whatever that shortcut script is for creating a React app, because Next.js and Gatsby both build React apps, and yet they give you so much more out of the box. So the thing that I like about React is that the routing just works. And I've played with Next.js a little, not a lot recently. It was probably about 2 years ago since the last time I looked at it. And for me, React is more of a logical fit. My brain works well with it. But I'm planning on using Next.js and playing around with it a little more because I like the hybrid model where there can be server-rendered stuff. So React is more, Gatsby is more static site generation, whereas Next.js is more server-side rendering. But both, well, Next.js can also do static site generation, whereas Gatsby, I don't think, has the server-side rendering thing built in. I mean, it's got this SSR down here, which is where the server-side rendering stuff can happen. But I think the Next.js does server-side rendering more natively, from what I understand. I'm not huge into server-side rendering, so don't take that as gospel. But that's my understanding of the difference between those two. The reason why I prefer Gatsby over React is that starting one up and getting it running and having the routing working and the built-in GraphQL capabilities and all of those things are things that I don't have to do to my React app, which I would probably have to do anyway. So doing Gatsby new blog or Gatsby new whatever, it just gets me bootstrapped so much faster. It also gives me the ability to do a whole lot of clever build stuff if I want to. Like we could launch this as a pure React app without using any of Gatsby's build mechanism. and just do it that way. Or we can also, so it's as good as React and then some. So I don't see the point in just using React anymore when Gatsby does exactly the same thing and gives you more power out of the box.
Makes total sense.
Right, so that's running. We've got our default starter here. So let's jump into our header again. And I want to add somewhere. We've got our header, we've got our name here. Let's put it in this point here. We're going to add in our nav. So let's stick nav in there, and we'll do a new make this an unordered list. And in here we want home and admin. Let's just make sure that's working. There's home and admin. Actually, let's move that outside of purple so I don't have to start doing a whole lot of restyling. Oops, that one. It's not working either, and that's not going to break. So not actually putting it in the header after all. Anyway, so we've got our home and our admin. Let's just put a tiny bit of styling on this. What's wrong with that? I don't know. Let's not bother with the styling. I was going to center it just so it was easier to see right up there. We've got our home and our admin. Let's turn these into links. Just copy and paste that to make it easier. And this one will send to an admin page. Right, so there's links now. Make that a capital A because I'm a pedant. All right, so we've got home. Admin currently doesn't exist, so let's just jump in quickly, and we will save this as admin. So now we have rebuilding. Do you have an error? It's rebuilding. Why are you not working? I don't think I need to rename the component. It's taking a long time to do that rebuild. Well, I'm going to rename this anyway.
It's only taking a long time because you're being recorded. Everything takes twice as long.
There you go. I just renamed it and that fixed it. So it probably was a namespace clash. So now we've got our home page and our admin page. Let's just change this to say admin and admin. There we go. Really doesn't want to be very effective today, does it? All right, so we've got that. We now want to make sure that the admin page is only accessed for people who are logged in. So it used to be that you could come into the within the definition here of the component, and you can use the auth0 hook to pull out to find out if somebody's authenticated, and if they are, then you can show certain elements. There's a helper now built into the React SDK that we had, which is called with authentication required. If I hit save on that and then switch back here, I did nothing else other than switch. It's automatically sent me to the login page.
Wow.
So if we go back to localhost port 8000, so the home page works fine. If I click on admin, it goes to admin at the top and then redirects directly. So this is logging into the tenant now. I have a user account in there already. For anybody following along, if you've just created the tenant for the first time, you'll need to sign up. And now, because we're running on localhost, because the configuration says localhost, it'll check for third-party app approval. This also happens, you can set this when you log in and you want to talk to an actual third-party API, for example, and that API wants to get certain information out of you. If you're running this in production, if I took this whole application and put it into a production environment or a staging environment where the URL wasn't localhost, then this wouldn't come up. It's only because we're in a dev environment at the moment. All right, so I'm logged in, and now we can see the admin page. Other things we can do, let's just grab this.
I'm having flashbacks of all the authentication services that we built. I was in a startup called Compago. We built our own auth service. Now I think it took us anyway. I won't talk about it. But
took you a bit longer than that.
Took us a bit longer than that. Took us a few minutes.
Yeah. Right. Let's find out more about the user. So this is where the use auth0 hook comes in. So this hook is now able to use the provider that was wrapped around the whole application. And the same with authentication required. This is enabled by that provider. So the provider gives us information about the client ID and all of these things that the auth0 SDK needs to talk to auth0, to the auth0 tenant. And let's just in here do a JSON stringify. You're not auto-completing. There it is. User with, I can never remember what the second parameter is, but we'll just make it look a bit prettier. So here's the identity token that came back from auth0. And in fact, we can also, for fun, come in here. Let's create a logout button. What I want to show you is the token coming back into the application and how that authorization code works. So in the same way as in the admin here, we pulled out user from auth0, there are a couple of other things we can pull out. Let's just come up here. So one thing we want to pull out is loading. This is going to tell us whether the auth0 SDK is still setting up that connection to auth0 to find out what the current status is. For example, with this one here, if I open this in a new tab, that's not going to work. Well, I won't do it, but if I open that in a new tab, then by default, the new application doesn't have any of the variables of the tokens or anything in memory. So what it does is it does a background connection, that silent reauthentication, to say, hey, is the person logged in? While that's happening, we don't know whether the person's logged in or not, but is loading will be true. Once is loading is false, we can find out if the user is authenticated. If the user is not authenticated, then we can call the login with redirect method. If the user is authenticated, then we can call the logout method. So down here for logout, we can now say on click logout. We can also do login. So that's now going to show us both of these buttons here. And then, of course, this one here should be hidden if the user is authenticated. So we hide it if it is loading or if the user is authenticated. And this one here we hide if it's loading or the user is not authenticated. Now we have our logout button. So if I click on logout, we've now got login. Let's log in. Just going to close this so I get a normal cursor back again. Right, before I hit go, I'm going to clear this so we can see exactly what's happening. So I'm going to hit enter. You can see here that we are sent back to localhost port 8000. I don't know how easily that comes out on the screen. I don't know if I can make it bigger. It doesn't make that area bigger. But there's a code equals 4BJEMBL, blah, blah, blah. So that's the authorization code. So what's happened now is I've been redirected from auth0 back to localhost port 8000 with that code. So the browser is now going to take that from auth0 and pass it into the the application that's actually running inside is going to pass it back into React at this point. React is going to pull it out of the query string. If this was a server-side application like Python, then obviously it would send that into the server, and the server will be able to take the authorization code at that point there. And this code is then sent to token down here. So the code should be in here somewhere. There you go, 4BJEM, blah, blah, blah. So the application is now making a request back to auth0, back to the, here it is, back to the Ben Dechrai test auth0.com. And it's making a request to the auth token endpoint. And it's saying, hey, I've got this client ID, that's me. I've got a code that you just gave me. I've got the code verifier, which is also sent back in that query string at the top there. That's the where is that? I'm not quite sure how it generates that. And then here's the redirect URI. Here's where I want you to go back to once you've authenticated me. And then the, although it's not going to, what's the redirect URI doing there? Because the response is basically the JSON web token. So here we can see an access token, which is an opaque token. It's not actually a JSON web token. And the ID token, which I don't like Chromium because it doesn't show me. Can I do preview? Oh, there we go. It shows me something I can copy more easily. So let's have a look at what a token looks like. AWT.io is a tool written by one of my colleagues, which allows you to find out exactly what's going on inside. If you haven't seen one before, cool. It's three components separated by full stops, or the header, the payload, and the signature. The header and the payload are base64 URL encoded. So if you stick this into a base64 URL decoder, you'll get this JSON out. Notice there's no security, there's no encryption, there's nothing like this is publicly readable. If you leak a token, people can see exactly what's going on inside the token header and inside the payload. The header will tell you, though, which algorithm has been used to generate the signature. And then the signature can be used to verify that the payload hasn't been changed. And that can be done both, in this case, because RS or RSA-256, RSA SHA-256 hashing, it's a public-private key mechanism. There's also HS or HMAC SHA-256, which is a pre-shared key-based hashing algorithm where every system needs to know what that pre-shared key is. So slightly less secure, but easier to distribute sometimes. So you can see here, there's the data that came back. That's my identity token, which matches what was in here.
Right.
So that's a bit of a detour there to see what's going on in terms of the authorization flow.
It's remarkably simple, and it's and really quite powerful when you see it out like this. But it also makes you realize what's going on in the background too, because there's quite a lot that happens behind the scenes, And when you go to start, like if you've ever written your own authentication service, there's a lot of this stuff that you don't really think about when you're first going about how stuff is going to be passed and the different pitfalls and
that's right.
What additional securities that you have. So it's super. Like you really hone in on the point here of just don't build your own authentication.
Don't build your own. There's so much going on. But at the same time, while we've seen how much is going on and what measures are taken to keep your application secure, when we think about it, the only code we've really written is this that I copied and pasted.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is now just all functional. This one line here, adding that in basically protected the whole web page, but then showing whether or not you want buttons, they come straight out of the hooks. So there wasn't really any coding done other than this to get it integrated, plus, of course, installing the NPM module. It just took me half an hour to do because I talk a lot.
And once a user's authenticated and logged in using auth0, can you then pull information about that user from let's say that they've used a third-party login, let's say they've used GitHub. Can we pull information from GitHub about that user and use that within our app?
Sort of yes and no. Let's do a login with, okay, I don't want to log in with Google or LinkedIn. So let's have a look over here. Let's come back. So under connections, this is where you define all the different ways people can log in. By default, there's this username password authentication that's created as part of every tenant. That's where we store your information. I did a video the other day on using MongoDB instead, so you can use your own external connections. You don't actually have to store your users in our database at all. And then we've got the social logins here. So I'm going to enable Twitter, which I think I can do just by permitting Gatsby test to use this one. There's this one here. So let's refresh this page here. It's probably going to show me 2. You can have up to 2 on a free account. So let's come back in here. And I'm going to delete the LinkedIn one. What do I need to type in? LinkedIn. I need to start the login process again. There we go. Continue with Twitter. So now we can see we've got a better name. My previous name was just Ben because it took the Ben from before the @dechrai.com. We've got a different picture now as well. This will be my Twitter profile, whereas before I was using my Gravatar. And it's got a different subject now. Before it was prefixed with auth0 because it was an auth0 generated user. This is a Twitter generated user, and you'll probably find that might be my Twitter ID. If not, it's always going to be that comes back. So every time I do a login with Twitter for this application, it'll always come back with this subject. So this is what you use if you have your own database. Let's say you're doing that accounting app that we were talking about before, and you want somebody to be able to log in, create an account, and generate reports. Those reports and those accounts are going to be associated with that user. So you'll still need a user object in your database, even though you don't need to store credentials against that user object. But what you do need to store against that user object is this subject, so that when somebody logs in from the identity token, you can take this subject and say, okay, well, I now need to load my local user where that user subject is equal to this value. So that's your link between the user that is defined in auth0 and your application data storage. Now, there are ways also of requesting access to more information from the Twitter authorization server. So you can get, like email address, for example, isn't in here. You could say in here that you want the scope to include, I wonder whether we can actually do that. Let's try it. So scope equals, now usually you'll have OpenID and another one. It's usually built in nowadays, so I always forget. Profile. So you usually have OpenID and profile. Let's see whether we can get the email out as well. So if we save that, we'll need to log out and log back in again. Oh, it looks like it's forcing us to anyway. Nope, log out. Log in with Twitter. Now I was expecting Twitter to say this application wants access to additional information. So I'm not sure exactly what the setting of these scopes would be, but you can request extra information out.
Right, yeah, of course.
You can also request to make, and I haven't tried this, it's something I should probably play with a bit more, but you can also request to make a request for an auth token, like an access token that will allow you to do things against Twitter itself. So I want to log in with Twitter, and then the application that I'm logging into, my Gatsby app, for example, should somehow then also get access to post to Twitter, to my Twitter timeline. So there are ways of doing that. I think it's a two-step process from the application perspective, in that you need to get the user to log in, and then you need to exchange that for some kind of access token. I haven't played with it enough to know exactly, but there are certainly ways of doing that.
For sure, not vital for this. Oh,
good.
For this example. No, let's do it. Okay, come on. Well, look, it's super cool, and I think I like the way that we kind of formatted this, because we've been able to demonstrate a lot of what you talked about at the start,
cool.
Which is cool. So we've gone a little bit over time, but I really appreciate you taking a moment to talk about this and run through.
That's
and
right.
Hopefully we've converted a few people and steered them away from trying to go out and create their own authentication services for their MVPs.
Cool. I hope so. And like I always say, even if you don't use Auth0, don't roll your own.
Yeah. All right, Ben. Thanks so much, mate. And I'll talk to you next time.
Thank you. Take care.
Yeah.